The morning after our wedding, I saw the truth about my husband, and my heart shattered. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the sheer curtains, spilling gold across the crisp white sheets. I stirred awake slowly, feeling the warmth of the blanket around me and the faint scent of lavender from the candles we had left burning the night before. Everything felt surreal, almost dreamlike, as though the previous day had been a carefully scripted moment I wasn't sure I had actually lived. I turned slightly, expecting to see him asleep beside me, his face relaxed in the soft morning light. But instead, he was already sitting up, scrolling on his phone, his brow slightly furrowed. The quiet sound of his tapping on the screen felt loud in the otherwise peaceful room. I blinked, unsure whether to feel comforted by his presence or disturbed by the distance I suddenly noticed. My eyes drifted over the room, taking in the details I had barely seen in the chaos of wedding celebrations. The neatly folded towels, the half-empty coffee mugs on the nightstand, the soft hum of the air conditioning. The room smelled faintly of our champagne glasses from last night, mingled with the lingering aroma of the rose petals I had scattered earlier. Everything seemed perfect, and yet there was a subtle tension that prickled at the back of my mind. I sat up fully, brushing a strand of hair from my face, and watched him as he scrolled, oblivious to my gaze. He smiled briefly at something on the screen, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was a stiffness to his shoulders, a hesitation in the way he leaned back against the headboard, and I couldn't explain why it made my stomach twist. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things after such an emotionally charged day. The soft rustle of the sheets as I swung my legs over the side of the bed was accompanied by the faint sound of traffic from outside, ordinary and grounding. I padded across the room to the small balcony, feeling the cool morning air brush against my bare arms. The city below was waking up slowly, lights flickering off one by one as the sun climbed higher. I drew a deep breath, the air scented faintly with morning dew, trying to anchor myself in this moment of supposed happiness. He didn't follow me, and I noticed for the first time how quiet he was, so quiet it felt unusual. I glanced over my shoulder and caught a brief flicker of something in his expression, almost like guilt, but I wasn't sure. My heart felt heavier than it should have, even in the glow of our wedding bliss. I shook my head slightly, scolding myself silently for reading too much into a morning after a night of celebration. I returned to the bed to retrieve my phone and noticed a small, crumpled envelope lying on the nightstand. It wasn't addressed to me, and there was no note, just my husband's name written in neat, careful handwriting. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over it, feeling a prickle of unease I couldn't quite place. Something about it seemed out of place, though I tried to convince myself it was trivial, a leftover from a last-minute wedding errand. Sitting back on the edge of the bed, I ran my fingers through my hair and tried to focus on the memories of yesterday, the laughter, the dance, the way everyone had cheered as we kissed for the last time as single people. My chest felt tight, though, as if a shadow had crept into the room overnight. Even the sound of his soft breathing from the bed felt oddly unfamiliar, like I was noticing him anew, and not in a comforting way. I stood and walked slowly toward the window again, letting the sunlight wash over my face. The warmth should have been reassuring, but it only highlighted the dissonance in my thoughts. I could feel the faint tension in my muscles, the way my shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing for something I didn't yet understand. I focused on the scent of fresh linen, trying to ground myself in the sensory details, to remind myself that everything was supposed to be perfect. Finally, I returned to the bed, sitting cross-legged and letting my hands rest on my knees. The room felt silent except for the soft ticking of the clock on the nightstand and the occasional hum from the air conditioner. I watched him again, scrolling, his lips moving slightly as he read something on his screen, unaware of me watching. A quiet melancholy settled over me, not sharp or loud, just a gentle weight that pressed against my chest. I lay back slowly, letting the blankets rise and fall with me, and closed my eyes for a moment. The warmth of the sun on my skin, the faint scent of the lavender candles, the distant city sounds, they all blended together, a comforting melody masking the small, inexplicable unease that had begun to creep in. My heart felt full, but also slightly hollow, as if a quiet warning had been whispered just for me. I opened my eyes and glanced once more at him, sitting so close yet feeling so distant. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to savor the memory of the wedding day, of all the smiles, the cheers, the love we had shared with family and friends. And then, a subtle pang of uncertainty threaded through the moment, soft and almost imperceptible, leaving me with a quiet question I couldn't yet articulate. I breathed deeply, letting the tension roll off my shoulders, telling myself it was just the afterglow of a long night. The soft warmth of the room, the gentle light, the mundane familiarity of our surroundings, all of it should have been enough. But in that quiet, perfect morning, something shifted in the air between us, unspoken and delicate, leaving me with a faint, uneasy pulse at the center of my chest that I poured myself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the room, hoping it would ground me and settle the flutter of nerves in my chest. The steam curled upward, warm against my face, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to think everything was normal. But when I looked toward him again, he was still hunched over his phone, thumbs moving quickly, eyes flicking with attention that didn't belong in the calm morning light. The way he avoided my gaze made my stomach knot. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that the wedding day had been exhausting and maybe he just needed a quiet moment. Still, the small details gnawed at me. The way he jumped slightly when a notification pinged, the slight twitch in his jaw, the way he tapped the screen a little too forcefully. Something felt off, and I couldn't ignore it. I sat across from him at the small breakfast table in our suite, the white linen tablecloth crisp beneath my fingertips. I took a sip of coffee and watched him glance toward the door as if expecting someone, or perhaps dreading a knock. The sunlight glinted off the silverware, and I noticed a faint crease between his eyebrows I hadn't seen before. My heart skipped, a quiet alarm sounding somewhere deep inside me. The soft clink of a spoon against my mug broke the silence, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I forced it out slowly, trying to steady the sense of unease creeping through my chest. I reminded myself that we had just gotten married, that nothing could ruin this day. And yet, the nervous energy radiating from him made it impossible to feel completely safe, even in the warmth of our room. He finally looked up at me, offering a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was a tension there I couldn't quite name, a subtle distance that made me pause. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but the words caught in my throat, replaced by a hesitant silence. The quiet between us felt heavy, charged with unspoken questions that neither of us dared voice. I shifted slightly in my seat, glancing out the window at the city slowly coming alive. Cars moved like tiny ants below, their headlights glinting in the soft morning haze. The air was fresh, carrying faint scents of grass and morning dew from the courtyard. I breathed it in, trying to anchor myself in the moment, but my eyes kept drifting back to him. The unease I felt was tangible now, almost pressing against my ribs. There was a small envelope lying near his side of the table, partially hidden, under a napkin. I hesitated before reaching for it, my fingers brushing the edge, but I pulled back. Something about the way it was tucked away, and the way he didn't seem to notice it, made a small bell of alarm ring in my mind. I told myself it was probably nothing, an errand note, a receipt, but my intuition refused to settle. He finally put the phone down, running a hand through his hair and letting out a soft sigh. The sound should have been comforting, but instead it felt like a weight pressing down on the room. I could feel the subtle stiffness in his movements, the way he kept his hands just a little too close to himself, as though protecting something I wasn't meant to see. My chest tightened at the thought. I tried to make conversation, small talk about breakfast or the wedding, but his responses were clipped, distracted, almost rehearsed. Each word felt measured, and I couldn't shake the sensation that he was hiding something. Not from the world, but from me. The idea made my stomach churn, though I still wanted to believe I was overthinking. As I stirred my coffee, The metallic clink of the spoon sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I noticed the way his eyes darted to the door again, and a faint chill ran down my spine. I wanted to laugh at myself for imagining danger where there was none, yet my instincts refused to be silenced. The morning, which should have felt like a soft continuation of our wedding joy, now carried an undercurrent of tension I couldn't ignore. I pushed the cup away slightly, feeling the warmth of it seep into my hands, and tried to steady my breathing. There was a quiet ache behind my ribs, a low thrum of anxiety mingled with confusion. I longed to reach out to him, to bridge the distance I suddenly felt, but the subtle cues, the tenseness, the avoidance, the distracted movements, made me pause. Finally, I rose from my chair and walked to the window again, letting the light fall across my face. The city below sparkled in the morning sun, ordinary and indifferent, while my own life felt suddenly fragile. The quiet hum of air conditioning and distant traffic contrasted sharply with the tension building between us, a silent note of uncertainty threading through the perfect morning. I lingered there, hands resting lightly on the railing, listening to the soft sounds around me, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. But even in the sunlight and calm, I couldn't ignore it. The subtle dissonance in his presence, the tiny behaviors that didn't fit the man I thought I knew. A quiet worry settled in my chest, soft yet insistent, leaving me with a fragile sense of anticipation I couldn't place. When I first met him, everything about our connection felt effortless. I remember the warmth of his smile, the way his eyes softened whenever he looked at me, and how safe I felt sitting beside him in those early days. We spent hours talking at a small cafe downtown, the smell of roasted coffee beans lingering in the air while soft music played in the background. His voice was calm, steady, and it wrapped around me like a promise I didn't know I needed. Back then, every detail about him felt reassuring. The way he held the door open, the way he listened with his whole body leaning slightly toward me, the way he remembered tiny things I said in passing. These moments stitched together a picture of a man I believed was thoughtful and grounded. I never once questioned his sincerity, not even when small inconsistencies surfaced. I brushed them away like dust on a windowsill, focusing on the light instead. I think about those early months often, the long evening walks, the cool breeze brushing my hair, the faint smell of pine from the trees lining the park path. He always held my hand tightly, guiding me gently as though he wanted to protect me from everything beyond the reach of his arm. I didn't realize then how much I relied on that feeling of security, how deeply I sunk into the comfort of being wanted. Even the first time he canceled a date at the last minute, I didn't think much of it. He sent a quick apology, saying work had run late, and I told myself it was normal. His behavior that night, slightly distracted, his phone buzzing more than usual, barely registered as a concern. I chalked it up to stress. I wanted to believe everything was fine, and so I did. The soft glow of streetlights on his face made him look tired but sincere, and I let that be enough for both of us. A few weeks later, he disappeared for a weekend without much explanation. He said he needed time to recharge, and although the excuse felt thin, I told myself that everyone deserved space. When he returned, he handed me a small gift, a silver necklace with a delicate charm, and hugged me as if he'd missed me deeply. The faint scent of cologne lingered on his shirt, a smell I didn't recognize, but I pushed the thought aside. I was too relieved to question anything. Looking back, the signs were there in the small details. The way he guarded his phone like it held something fragile, the quick flashes of irritation when I asked simple questions, the way he deflected conversations about his past. At the time, though, I interpreted those things as quirks, not warnings. I believed his explanations, even when they didn't fully make sense. I wanted to believe in him more than I wanted clarity. My friends occasionally hinted that something felt off. They pointed out the times he seemed distracted or distant during group outings, or how he avoided talking about his family. I laughed it off, brushing their concerns aside with an ease that now feels naive. I thought I knew him better than anyone else. I thought the quiet moments we shared, the late-night talks, the warmth of his hand on my back, meant something deeper something unshakable. There were nights when he'd come over smelling faintly of cigarette smoke, even though he told me he didn't smoke. I asked once, and he said he'd walk past someone outside his office. I believed him. I didn't want to imagine a version of him that didn't fit the story I'd built in my mind. Love, or what I thought was love, has a way of softening edges that should stay sharp. It convinces you that questions are unnecessary, that doubts are disloyal. As we grew more serious, he became even more attentive. He took me on weekend trips, planned small surprises, and held me close in ways that felt intimate and grounding. He looked at me like I was the center of his universe. Or maybe he looked at me the way he thought I wanted to be looked at. I didn't know then that sincerity and performance can mimic each other so convincingly. Even now, I can still picture the way he kissed my forehead when we talked about marriage. His lips were warm, gentle, lingering long enough to make me feel cherished. I remember the soft hum of the dishwasher running in the background, the glow of the kitchen lights reflecting off his wedding proposal plans spread across the table. Every piece of that moment felt genuine, and I soaked it in without hesitation. It wasn't until later, much later, that I realized how much of our relationship I had filled in myself. I had taken fragments of affection and built a whole person around them, shaping him into the partner I wanted him to be. The truth is, I never let myself look too closely at the shadows around him. I was too invested in the light. But on mornings like this one, with the quiet tension hanging between us and my heart tightening with unspoken questions, I couldn't help replaying those memories. I wondered how much of what I remembered was real and how much I had created in my own hopefulness. I wondered when the small signs had shifted from harmless quirks to something heavier. And as I sat in the soft morning light, I felt a quiet ache settle inside my chest, a gentle reminder that the man I thought I knew might never have existed at all. The first real moment of doubt came on a quiet Wednesday evening, long before the wedding was even on the horizon. I remember sitting on my couch, wrapped in a soft throw blanket, the smell of the lemon-scented candle drifting through the room. He had told me he would come over after work, that he couldn't wait to see me. But the hours stretched on, and the familiar hum of evening traffic outside my apartment window began to feel like a reminder of how long I had been waiting. When he finally arrived, his shirt was wrinkled, his hair slightly mussed, and he carried an energy that didn't match his explanation. He said he'd been stuck in a meeting, his voice smooth but his eyes darting briefly toward the floor. I noticed the faint scent of a floral perfume clinging to his jacket, sweet, unfamiliar, and far too noticeable to come from a passing stranger. My chest tightened for a moment, but I forced the thought away, telling myself he probably brushed against someone in an elevator. We sat together on the couch, but something about his presence felt off. His shoulders were tense, his leg bounced slightly, and his hands moved in restless motions, tapping the armrest or rubbing the back of his neck. I tried to relax against him, leaning my head on his shoulder, but he flinched, just a small twitch, barely perceptible. Still, it lodged itself in my mind like a tiny splinter I didn't want to acknowledge. After a few minutes, he stood up abruptly and said he needed a glass of water. I watched the way he walked to the kitchen, quick and stiff, as if he were trying to escape a spotlight. The overhead lights reflected off the stainless steel appliances, giving the room a cool, sharp glow that made the tension in the air feel even more pronounced. I listened to the soft sound of the faucet running, my pulse suddenly too loud in my ears. He returned with the water, but didn't sit close this time. Instead, he settled at the far end of the couch, his body turned slightly away from me. It was a subtle shift, but it stung in a way I couldn't explain. I searched his face for warmth, for the familiar softness I had grown accustomed to, but his gaze kept drifting to his phone on the coffee table. Each glance made my nerves pull tighter. When the phone finally buzzed, he snatched it up so quickly that the sudden movement startled me. His eyes flicked across the screen, and his expression tightened before he flipped the phone over and placed it face down. My breath hitched, a brief flicker of suspicion rising and falling like a wave I refused to let crash. He smiled at me, quick, thin, practiced, and said it was nothing important. I nodded, pretending to believe him, pretending not to notice the distinct tremor in his hand. Later that night, after he left, I found myself staring at my darkened living room, the faint ticking of the wall clock echoing in the quiet. The lemon candle had burned low, its flames soft and wavering, casting shifting shadows across the coffee table. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself that relationships had complicated days, that stress could make anyone behave strangely. But the uneasy feeling clung to me, refusing to fade even as I blew out the candle and stepped into the cool darkness of my bedroom. In the days that followed, more small inconsistencies appeared, though I tried to ignore them. He started canceling plans more often, always with rushed explanations. He became ghostly quiet during conversations about the future, his eyes unfocused, his smile half-hearted. When I'd reach for his hand while walking beside him, sometimes he would pull away as if lost in thought. I told myself he was overwhelmed with work, that he would come around. Love, at that time, felt like forgiveness without reason. One afternoon, while waiting for him at a small cafe we frequented, I noticed the barista giving me a sympathetic smile as she refilled my water glass. I realized I had been sitting alone for almost an hour, tapping my fingers lightly against the smooth surface of the table. The cafe smelled of warm pastries and coffee grounds, a familiar comfort that only highlighted the absence of the one person I wanted beside me. My heart sank slightly, but when he finally arrived, breathless and flustered, I offered him a soft smile, pretending the weight hadn't stung. He apologized repeatedly, reaching for my hand across the table. His palm felt warm, but his fingers were slightly cold, and the contrast made me shiver. He rambled about unexpected work problems, about a colleague who needed his help, and I nodded along, even though his story didn't align with the timestamps of his messages. A part of me knew something was shifting between us, but I was too afraid to question what it meant. The truth was I cared for him deeply, maybe too deeply. I wanted to preserve the version of him I had fallen for, the man who laughed freely, who held me close, who whispered soft reassurances on nights when the world felt heavy. I clung to those memories, using them to cover the growing cracks I sensed beneath the surface. But the more I tried to smooth those cracks over, the more jagged they seemed to become. By the time we reached the point of talking seriously about marriage, the unease had become a quiet presence in the back of my mind, something I felt during quiet moments when he wasn't looking. I told myself every couple had imperfections, every love story had bumps. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew something in his story didn't quite add up. And yet, I kept going, hoping the doubts would fade instead of deepen. I remember the first time my best friend hinted that something didn't feel right. We were sitting together on our back porch, the warm scent of grilled corn drifting from a neighbor's yard, while fireflies blinked lazily in the fading summer light. She watched me talk about him, about how charming he was, how thoughtful, and her expression softened into something that looked like concern. She didn't say much, just asked gentle questions about the things he'd been canceling or why he never joined us for weekend outings anymore. I laughed it off, brushing away her worries with a confidence I didn't truly feel. But later that night, as I lay in bed, her quiet tone lingered in my mind like an echo I couldn't quite ignore. He'd become increasingly protective of his phone by then. Whenever a notification buzzed, he shifted slightly, angling the screen away from my line of sight. The soft glow of the display sometimes illuminated his face at night, casting sharp shadows across his features as he stared at messages he never explained. I would turn toward him, pretending to adjust my pillow, and he'd immediately lock the screen. The sudden movement always sent a faint prick of anxiety through me, though I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than habit. Around that time, I noticed he developed a tendency to disappear emotionally when we talked about our future. We'd be sitting on my couch, a movie playing quietly in the background, and I'd casually mention a trip we might take or an apartment we could look at together. His posture would stiffen ever so slightly, his fingers pausing mid-motion as he absent-mindedly traced the edge of a throw cushion. He'd nod along, giving short responses that didn't match the enthusiasm I expected. The shift was subtle, but enough to make my chest tighten in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. His stories began to conflict, too. He'd tell me he was meeting a coworker for drinks after work, only for the same coworker to post photos from a family gathering that very night. When I mentioned it later, he brushed it off with an easy laugh, saying plans had changed last minute. His explanations were smooth, practiced, almost too convenient. I wanted to challenge him, to press further, but every time I tried, I felt a wave of guilt for doubting him. Love, or the version of love I had fallen into, made second-guessing him feel like a betrayal. One evening, while we were out to dinner, I noticed the way his eyes kept darting toward the entrance. Each time the door opened, he shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening slightly before he forced another smile at me. The restaurant's warm lighting cast a soft, buttery glow across our table, but his expression held a strain that didn't match the intimate atmosphere. I told myself he was anxious from work or tired from the long week, but deep down, a small voice whispered another reason, one I pushed aside as soon as it surfaced. The way he reacted to unexpected kindness also changed. When I surprised him with his favorite dessert from the bakery near my workplace, he looked startled instead of happy. His shoulders tensed, his brow furrowed, and he let out a nervous laugh that didn't sound like him. He thanked me, but the gratitude felt hollow, almost forced, as though my thoughtful gesture had disrupted some carefully kept routine I didn't know existed. There were times when he seemed like the man I had loved in the beginning. He'd hold me close during quiet nights, the soft rhythm of his breathing brushing against my neck, and I'd feel that familiar warmth spread through me. But even then, there was something distant in his posture, a faint stiffness that didn't belong. It was like hugging someone who wasn't fully present, someone whose mind was already drifting somewhere else. I could feel it, though I pretended not to. My family noticed the changes, too. At a small barbecue my parents hosted, he spent most of the time pacing along the edge of the yard, checking his phone with increasing urgency. The smell of charcoal and grilled chicken filled the air, while my cousins laughed loudly as they tossed a football across the lawn. Meanwhile, he stood apart, shoulders tense, barely engaging in conversation. When I asked if everything was okay, he offered a quick, tight smile and said he had a lot on his mind. It was the kind of answer that explained nothing, but I nodded anyway. The truth was, I didn't want to see the cracks forming. Each time something fell off, I layered over it with excuses, convincing myself I was being paranoid. I was invested deeply, emotionally, completely, and the idea of questioning him felt like threatening everything we had built. I clung to the good moments, the soft laughs, the shared dinners, the gentle touches, letting them overshadow the unease that kept tugging quietly at my thoughts. Looking back, I realized how much I silenced my own intuition. The warnings were there, the evasiveness, the guarded behavior, the shifting stories, the emotional absence. They appeared slowly, weaving themselves into the fabric of our relationship until they felt almost normal. I grew accustomed to the little disappointments, to the sharp pangs of unease, to the quiet sense that something wasn't quite right. I accepted them because losing him felt scarier than confronting the truth. But as our wedding approached, those cracks widened. The small moments I once brushed aside began to collect, forming a quiet weight that settled heavy in my chest. I didn't yet understand what they pointed to, but I felt the tension building, subtle and persistent. And even though I tried to push the discomfort away, it stayed, unmoving, unignorable, waiting for the day everything would finally come into focus. I didn't expect anything unusual to happen that morning. I was still riding the soft glow of the wedding, the sweet blur of vows and music, and people hugging us until my cheeks hurt. I remember walking across the suite barefoot, feeling the coolness of the marble floor under my feet, thinking it was going to be an easy, peaceful start to our married life. My dress was still draped across the back of a chair, and the lingering scent of roses from my bouquet filled the air. Everything felt suspended, as if life itself was giving us one quiet moment before the world resumed its pace. He was in the bathroom showering, humming faintly over the running water. I smiled at the sound. It felt familiar, comforting, something that reminded me of our early mornings together before all the wedding chaos began. I picked up a few things scattered across the nightstand. My earrings, a lipstick cap, and his phone, which was sitting half-tilted on the edge. I only moved it so. It wouldn't slide off, but the screen lit up the second it shifted in my hand. A message flashed across the top. At first, the words didn't register. It felt like my brain refused to absorb what my eyes were seeing. It was something simple, too simple. Last night killed me. I thought you'd text me back. Are you okay? There was a heart at the end. Just a single, small heart, but it felt like someone had pressed a hot iron against my chest. I froze, the phone still in my hand, the light from the screen glowing against my palm. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it was a cousin. Maybe it was about something innocent. Maybe it was meant for someone else entirely. My stomach tightened as I forced myself not to panic, not to jump to conclusions, not to let my imagination build a story out of nothing. But the sender's name wasn't saved, and the area code wasn't familiar, and the tone of the message, that tone wasn't platonic. It sounded intimate, worried, disappointed. A small shiver ran up my arms, raising goosebumps. I set the phone down, but the words stayed with me, floating inside my skull like they had been carved into the air. I could still hear him humming in the shower, warm and oblivious. The contrast made me feel sick. My heart started to beat faster, though the rest of my body felt strangely still, like it didn't know how to react. I took a slow breath, trying to think rationally. Maybe it was someone from work. Maybe a friend teasing him. Maybe someone texting the wrong number. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the message replayed in my head. Last night killed me. What about last night? He was with me all night, wasn't he? The reception, the private room his friends crowded around him in, the moments when he slipped out to talk to the DJ, the brief time he claimed he was checking with the event coordinator. I sat down on the edge of the bed because my legs suddenly felt unsteady. The mattress dipped beneath me, and I stared at the bathroom door, listening to the muffled rhythm of the shower. Everything felt different now. The sunlight pouring through the curtains was too bright, the room too quiet, my own thoughts too loud. Another vibration buzzed across the nightstand. This time the message preview was shorter. Please tell me you're safe. I barely slept. Something inside me broke a little. Not loudly, not dramatically, more like a quiet snap of a thread I didn't realize was holding me together. I didn't touch the phone again. I didn't need to. Questions formed quickly, tumbling one after another. Why was someone messaging him like this the morning after our wedding? Why did they sound so worried, so emotionally connected, so expectant? And why hadn't he told me about anyone in his life who might send something like that? I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to ease the sudden cold that had settled under my skin. The sweet scent of roses that had comforted me minutes earlier now felt suffocating. I kept thinking about every moment from the night before, his short disappearances, his distracted eyes, the way he pulled his phone away when one of his groomsmen grabbed it to take a picture of us. At the time, I brushed it off. Now, the memory felt sharper. The water in the shower shut off. My breath caught without meaning to. I didn't know what to do. I felt unprepared, exposed, as if the truth had entered the room before he did. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, demand an explanation, ask who this person was, and why they cared so deeply about whether he slept. But another part of me, quieter, steadier, told me to wait, to breathe, to understand before reacting. The bathroom door opened, releasing a wave of steam that curled through the air. He stepped out with a towel around his waist, smiling like everything was perfect, like the ground beneath my feet hadn't shifted. I watched him, try to read his face, his posture, his expression. I wondered if he could see the change in me, or if I was doing too good a job masking. The sudden hollow feeling in my chest. I didn't say anything. Not yet. But in that moment, the morning no longer felt soft or peaceful. It felt like the beginning of something I hadn't asked for, and something I wasn't ready to face that I didn't sleep much that night. Even though we were still technically in the honeymoon suite, wrapped in what should have been newlywed warmth, my mind kept circling around those messages like a storm that wouldn't shift. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words again, glowing against my palm. By morning, I felt hollowed out, like something inside me had been scooped away without warning. He slept deeply beside me, breathing evenly, completely unaware of the way my world had already begun to tilt. I got out of bed, quietly, careful not to wake him. The carpet felt thick under my feet, muffling every step, but my own heartbeat was loud enough to drown out everything else. I walked to the window and stared out at the parking lot below, watching people load luggage into their cars, sipping coffee, moving through their normal routines. It struck me how calm everything looked, how ordinary. Meanwhile, I felt like I was holding a secret that was pressing against my ribs, demanding to be acknowledged. When he finally stirred, he stretched with a soft groan, smiling the way he always did in the mornings. For a split second, I almost let myself fall back into that version of us. The easy mornings, the soft laughs, the gentle teasing. But then his phone lit up on the nightstand. My eyes jumped to it before I could stop myself. I didn't see the message this time, just the screen glowing and his hand reaching for it a little too quickly. He turned the phone face down once he picked it up, a small, practiced motion that made something tighten in my chest. Maybe he'd always done that. Maybe I'd never noticed. But now it felt like a clue. A tiny lie sitting right there in plain sight. He murmured something about checking the time, though he didn't actually look at the clock after he set the phone down. That was the moment I realized I needed to pay attention. For the rest of the morning, I watched him without letting it seem like I was watching. I studied the way he avoided putting the phone anywhere I could see it, how he kept it in his pocket even when it buzzed. He tried to act casual, but his shoulders stiffened each time a notification came through. He'd smile at me, but the smile sat strangely on his face, too quick, too light, like something practiced. I didn't ask questions. Not yet. Instead, I stored every detail in my mind, letting each one settle into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I'd been assembling for months. When we went downstairs for breakfast, he ordered his usual black coffee, omelet, while I pushed my food around my plate, barely tasting anything. The dining room smelled like waffles and syrup and toasted bread, but the sweetness only made my stomach tighten. I tried to steady my voice as we talked about plans for the day, but my thoughts kept drifting to his pocket, with a faint outline of his phone pressed against the fabric of his jeans. Halfway through the meal, he excused himself to call the hotel desk because we needed extra towels. But instead of using the phone on the wall near the elevator, he walked outside, pacing near the edge of the parking lot. From the window, I watched him. I watched the way he kept his back slightly turned, watched how long he stayed on the call, watched the way he rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he was anxious. When he came back, his expression was too neutral, too carefully arranged. He'd never been this hard to read before. Throughout the day, he offered explanations for everything. Why he stepped out, why he checked his phone, why he looked distracted, but each one felt thinner than the last. I could hear the cracks in his voice, the hesitation before he spoke, the small pauses where it seemed like he was choosing the safest version of the truth. By evening, the distance between us was impossible to ignore. We sat together, but it felt like we were on opposite sides of something invisible and heavy. He tried to hold my hand once, but even that fell off. His fingers were tense against mine, not relaxed like they usually were. I didn't pull away, but my thoughts were already wandering into darker corners, searching for answers he wouldn't give. The lies were small, almost delicate, but they were multiplying. A misplaced detail here, a timeline that didn't quite fit there, a change in tone whenever his phone buzzed. Things I might have brushed off before now felt like breadcrumbs leading somewhere I didn't want to go. Later that night, while he showered, I sat quietly on the edge of the bed again. I listened to the water running and watched the shadows move across the floor. I felt the same coldness from earlier settle beneath my skin. I wasn't imagining the shift. I wasn't overthinking. Something was happening. Something he didn't want me to see. I realized then that if I kept confronting him gently, light questions, curious looks, he'd keep slipping away behind excuses and half-truths. He was too practiced, too controlled. So instead, I made a choice to stop asking and start observing. Quietly, carefully, without letting him sense what I was piecing together. Because now, the truth felt close. Too close to ignore. And I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made a move that I couldn't take back, that I didn't intend to find anything that night. Honestly, I was hoping the unease in my chest would fade on its own, that maybe I could convince myself the messages were misunderstandings, or that they'd make sense if I simply waited long enough. But silence has a way of amplifying everything you're trying to suppress. And as he fell asleep beside me, breathing steadily with his arm draped over his pillow instead of around me, the room felt heavier than it ever had before. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of a door closing out in the hallway. My thoughts kept circling the same question. What else was he hiding? I didn't want to check his phone. I didn't want to be that person. I'd always believed trust meant respecting boundaries. But trust had already been fractured, and all I had now were suspicions that tightened like a fist inside my stomach. I wasn't planning to move, but when he shifted in his sleep, his phone slid slightly from the edge of the nightstand and tapped against the wood. It was such a small sound, but it made my heart jump. I propped myself up slowly, listening to make sure he was still breathing deeply. When I heard the steady rhythm of his sleep, I reached toward the nightstand, my fingers trembling even in the dark. The screen lit up with a gentle glow. No password. I felt a strange rush of relief and dread at the same time. Part of me wished it had been locked, that the universe had given me a sign to stop, but it opened without resistance, as if the truth had been waiting for me all along. I didn't scroll far. I didn't have to. The first message thread at the top was the same unsaved number I had seen earlier. This time, the full stream of messages was visible, and reading them felt like being submerged in cold water. There were dozens of texts, some recent, some from weeks before, each one threaded with an unmistakable intimacy. I'm counting down the days until you choose me. You promised you wouldn't go through with the wedding if you weren't sure. Last night felt different. You felt distant. My hands shook as I read, the phone casting pale light across the blankets. The room felt suddenly airless, like all the oxygen had been sucked away. I scrolled further back, each message hitting harder than the last. There were photos too, not explicit but warm, familiar, smiling faces pressed close together. He looked different in them, looser, younger, unburdened. A version of him I'd never seen. A version he never shared with me. There were also messages from just 20 minutes before we went down for breakfast that morning. Are you avoiding me? Please don't disappear now. And then the one that broke me open completely. You said she'd know eventually. When does this end? I didn't realize I was crying until a tear slid down onto the screen, making the text blur for a second. I wiped it away quickly, afraid of leaving any trace that I'd seen all of this. It felt surreal, reading words that didn't align with the man sleeping just inches away from me. My husband, who hours earlier had held my hand and kissed my forehead like nothing in the world could shake us. I set the phone back exactly where it had been and lay down slowly, making sure he wouldn't stir. My body felt hot and cold at the same time, like grief and adrenaline had fused into something electric. I stared at his silhouette in the faint glow of the bedside lamp. I tried to convince myself I was reading everything wrong. Maybe these messages were old. Maybe he had ended things. Maybe the other person was confused. But then I remembered the recent messages. The ones sent after the wedding. The ones about choosing. The ones asking why he hadn't responded. This wasn't old. This wasn't over. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional. I turned onto my side, facing away from him. My throat felt raw, but I forced myself to stay quiet, to breathe evenly, to move as little as possible. I couldn't let him know I knew. Not yet. Not when I didn't understand the full extent of what I was dealing with. And as painful as it was, a strange clarity began forming beneath the hurt, an understanding that I couldn't confront him without knowing everything. I needed to gather information, not emotions. In the morning, he acted normal. Too normal. He touched my shoulder lightly, offered me coffee, kissed my hair like he always did. But once you've seen the truth, every gesture feels rehearsed. I felt myself slipping into a new role without meaning to, observant, quiet, cautious. Throughout the day, I watched the way he checked his phone, the way his expression clouded for a split second whenever a notification buzzed. He thought I didn't notice. He thought I wasn't paying attention. But I was. I could feel the space between us widening in a way that couldn't be ignored anymore. My heart was hurting, but something else was growing beneath the pain. Something steady, something focused, something that felt like awakening. By the end of the day, I wasn't just suspicious. I knew. I knew there was someone else. I knew he'd lied to me for months. I knew the man I married wasn't the man he pretended to be. And worst of all, I knew the betrayal was deeper than I had imagined. But I also knew one more thing. I would not confront him until I understood everything he tried so hard to hide. The days that followed felt strangely heavy, as if I were moving through water instead of air. Everything looked the same. The way he poured his coffee, the sound of his keys dropping into the ceramic dish, the polite smile he gave whenever we crossed paths in the kitchen. But all of it felt rehearsed. I watched him more closely now, and the more I observed, the clearer it became that he was putting on a performance. He didn't know the script had already fallen apart. I started noticing little things I had ignored before. The way he angled his phone away from me when he typed. The quiet, clipped tone he used whenever he stepped into another room to take a call. The tightness in his jaw when a message came through at the wrong moment. Each detail added another layer to the picture forming in my mind. One that didn't match the man I thought I knew. One evening, while I pretended to scroll through my own phone on the couch, his buzzed 3 times in a row. He froze for a second. It was so small that most people wouldn't have caught it, but I was watching for any sign, any flinch. He grabbed the phone quickly, muttered something about a work update, and walked into the hallway. But instead of going to his office, he stepped outside onto the patio. Through the window, I could see him hunching over the screen, his shoulders tense. He looked around once, making sure I wasn't nearby. That was when the first flicker of unease shifted towards something darker, something like danger. Not physical danger, but emotional, psychological. The kind that comes from realizing someone you trusted is operating in shadows you didn't know existed. He stayed outside longer than necessary. When he finally returned, he wore a smile that didn't touch his eyes. He asked if I wanted to watch something, his voice too bright, too casual. I said yes, even though the idea of sitting beside him made my skin prickle with discomfort. I was learning, though, the less he suspected, the more he revealed. As the days passed, he became more protective of his devices. His phone never left his pocket. His laptop began carrying a new password, one he typed with exaggerated care, tilting the screen away from me. At first, he tried to act natural about it, but eventually his nervousness seeped through. He asked strange, probing questions. Had I talked to anyone from the wedding lately? Was I feeling okay? Was anything weighing on me? The way he studied me during those questions made my stomach twist. It felt like he was searching for cracks, trying to figure out whether I knew anything. His attempts at subtlety were clumsy, but the intention behind them was unmistakable. One night, while we were getting ready for bed, he casually mentioned that he was thinking about changing some passwords for safety. He said it lightly, but the way he watched my reflection in the mirror told me everything. He wasn't being cautious for technology's sake. He was being cautious for his own. Another time, he suggested we share our locations on our phones for convenience. The calm way he said it made my skin crawl. I declined gently, pretending I didn't think it was necessary, and he nodded as if it didn't matter. But I saw the flash in his eyes, brief, sharp, assessing. He was trying to monitor me. The thought unsettled me more than anything else. His behavior shifted further when he sensed me becoming less affectionate. It wasn't intentional on my part. I was simply withdrawing emotionally, trying to process everything. But he noticed. He leaned in too much, hovered too close, touched me more often, but with a stiffness that felt more like possession than love. Once, he grabbed my wrist just a little too firmly when I pulled away from a kiss too quickly. It wasn't violent, not enough to leave a mark, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. He released me immediately and joked about me being jumpy lately, but his eyes flicked toward my phone on the nightstand, as if wondering whether I had seen something new. It was in these small moments, the tension in his shoulders, the way he scanned rooms before speaking, the sudden bursts of charm that felt like cover-ups, that I realized he wasn't just hiding a secret relationship. He was worried about the collapse of it all, worried about what would happen if I exposed him. worried about losing control of the story he'd been crafting. That was when I understood the real shift. He wasn't trying to protect the other person. He was trying to protect himself. One evening, he suggested we take a weekend trip, just the two of us. He framed it as a romantic getaway, something to reconnect after the stress of the wedding. But the timing unsettled me. He'd never been the spontaneous romantic type, and his enthusiasm felt forced, strange. I declined, saying I had too much work. He didn't argue, but his disappointment was too theatrical, like he was performing hurt instead of feeling it. He spent the rest of the evening pacing the kitchen, checking his phone more often than usual, sighing dramatically as if hoping I'd ask what was wrong. But I didn't. I simply watched. And the more I watched, the more I began to see a pattern. When he felt me pulling away, he became clingy. When he sensed I was observing too closely, he became defensive. When he thought he was losing control, he shifted strategies: charm, guilt, distance, affection. A cycle of manipulation that made my chest tighten with the realization that I had never truly known the depth of his deceit. By the end of the week, I wasn't just hurt. I was alert, because the danger wasn't physical. It was psychological. The danger of being trapped in a relationship where the truth was a moving target, and every lie opened the door to another. And now that I knew, I could feel him watching me as closely as I was watching him. That I didn't know when I officially crossed the line from heartbroken wife to quiet investigator. But at some point in those tense days, something inside me shifted. I stopped reacting emotionally and started collecting information. Not because I wanted revenge, not yet, but because I needed the truth laid out in a way that couldn't be denied or twisted. I needed clarity, something solid to hold on to, while the rest of my world felt like it was sliding out from under me. It started with small things. I began saving receipts, taking photos of them before tucking them back exactly where they were. He wasn't careful with paper trails. He assumed I'd never look. But I was looking now, and I was learning how often he wasn't where he claimed to be. Meals charged to restaurants he'd never mentioned. Gas stations in towns he had no reason to drive through. A hotel charge from 2 weeks before the wedding that he had explained away as a work emergency. I believed him then. Now I saved the evidence. At first, gathering these things made me feel guilty, like I was betraying him in some way. But the more I uncovered, the more that guilt dissolved. He had created this distance, not me. I was simply walking through it, piecing together the truth brick by brick. One afternoon, while he was in the shower, I sat on the floor of our bedroom with his laundry basket beside me. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was simply following instincts I didn't know I had. When I reached into the pocket of one of his jeans, my fingers brushed against a folded receipt. The paper was damp around the edges, but still readable. A purchase from a jewelry store, dated just 3 days before the wedding. But he hadn't given me anything. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs as I read the description. A gold bracelet with a small diamond charm. Something delicate. Something romantic. Something I had never received. I snapped a picture of it with my phone, then slipped it back. My hands were trembling, but a strange steadiness settled over me at the same time. A duality, hurt and clarity, grief and purpose. For every discovery that stabbed at my heart, another part of me hardened with resolve. I started going through my own memories, too. Each moment I dismissed as stress or busyness or misunderstanding now took on a new meaning. The times he'd stepped outside to take a call, the canceled date nights, the way he'd suddenly become secretive about his schedule in the months leading up to the wedding. None of it was random. It all belonged to a pattern I had refused to see until now. I began writing things down in a notebook I kept hidden under the bed. Not because I planned some big confrontation, but because I didn't trust my own mind to hold everything without breaking. Every date, every strange behavior, every receipt, every inconsistency, it all went onto the pages, forming a timeline of deceit. And the clearer the timeline became, the more obvious it was that the betrayal hadn't been a momentary lapse or a single mistake. It was ongoing. It was intentional. It was woven through the fabric of our entire relationship. One night, he fell asleep early on the couch after insisting he was exhausted from work. I stood there for a moment, watching him breathe. I didn't feel anger the way I expected. I felt distance, a widening emotional canyon between us that I knew we'd never bridge again. While he slept, his phone slipped slightly from his hand, hanging halfway off the cushion. For a moment, I considered picking it up, but I didn't need more messages, not yet. I needed a different kind of truth. So instead, I opened his laptop. It was risky. I knew that, but I also knew something he had forgotten. Humans are creatures of habit. He used variations of the same few passwords for everything. It took 3 tries to unlock the screen. My pulse hammered in my ears as the desktop opened, glowing softly in the dim light. I wasn't prepared for how quickly I found what I wasn't even sure I was looking for. An email thread marked important, sitting at the top of his inbox. My breath caught as I clicked it open. At first, the messages were financial, loan agreements, credit statements, transfers he had never mentioned. But then there was the final email, the one that made my skin prickle and my throat tighten. It was from the same unnamed contact, the one from the texts, sent months ago, long before the wedding. It referenced plans they'd made, promises he'd given, a future they had discussed, one without me in it. They had talked about leaving me, before he proposed, before he bought the ring, before he vowed to love me in front of our families. It was no longer a possibility. It was confirmation. The deception hadn't been a private escape or a fleeting indiscretion. It had been a long-term plan. My heart broke in a different way then. Not just because he'd lied, but because I realized he had married me with entire intentions I'd never been aware of. I didn't understand all of it yet. The why, the how, the purpose behind such a tangled web. But the deception was no longer a question. It was a certainty. I closed his laptop softly, placed it back exactly as I found it, and stood there in the stillness, letting the truth settle into my bones. This wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. And for the first time, I knew I had to be smarter than my pain. I had to gather every detail, every piece of evidence, every forgotten truth. Because once I understood the full story, I would know exactly how to end it, quietly, cleanly, and without him ever seeing it coming. The more I observed him, the more obvious it became that his lies weren't just scattered. They were coordinated. There was a rhythm to them, a pattern that repeated whenever he felt he might be caught. The charming smiles, the casual explanations, the sudden distractions, they were all part of a careful choreography designed to keep me in the dark. And the realization that this was deliberate made the betrayal feel heavier than ever before. I started paying attention to how he interacted with our families. He had always seemed thoughtful, polite, even doting at times, but now I noticed the way he twisted words just slightly when speaking to them. A comment about a work project here, a vague excuse about a friend there, nothing that anyone else would notice. But to me, the small cracks in his stories were like tiny knives, cutting through the version of him I believed in. I could see him carefully crafting impressions, ensuring that no one suspected a thing, no one besides me. His manipulations extended beyond words. I discovered hidden bank transfers, subtle changes in shared accounts, small withdrawals that didn't match anything he'd told me about. Some of them were easy to rationalize at first. Maybe a forgotten bill, maybe a gift, but when I lined them up over months, the story became undeniable. He had carefully controlled money, information, and appearances, all while maintaining the illusion of being the devoted husband. The more I uncovered, the more deliberate it all seemed. Even his friendships were curated. I began noticing patterns in the people he spent time with, the ones who received secret messages, the ones he went out with without explanation, the ones who always seemed to know things I didn't. The network of deception had threads reaching into places I had assumed were private. My trust in him had been complete, and yet, now it was shattered entirely. I realized he had created a bubble in which he was the only one fully aware of the truth, leaving me completely vulnerable to his control. He was skilled at reading people, and I could see in the way he adjusted his behavior depending on the audience. Around friends, he was gregarious, playful, effortlessly charming. Around my family, he was careful, attentive, polite, so polite that it almost hurt to recognize how contrived it was. And around me, he could switch seamlessly between warmth and detachment, depending on whether he wanted to distract me from noticing inconsistencies or simply keep me emotionally tethered. It was exhausting just to watch. I started cataloging everything, not just receipts and messages, but behaviors, patterns, timelines. I made a spreadsheet on my laptop, quietly tracking his movements, conversations, and the subtle manipulations I observed daily. It wasn't about revenge at that point. It was about survival, about understanding exactly who I was married to and how deep the deception ran. I needed proof, a way to make sense of everything, to give myself solid ground beneath a foundation that had been built entirely on lies. The emotional toll was intense. I felt like I was living in a fog, alternating between heartbreak, anger, and cold calculation. I realized I couldn't let him see me unraveling. He thrived on distraction, on my trust, on my blindness. I had to stay calm, collected, and observant, even when my heart was breaking. Every smile I offered him, every casual glance, every normal conversation had to be measured. I couldn't give him any clue that I knew how much he had hidden from me. As the days went on, I noticed subtle shifts in his behavior. He became slightly more controlling, not aggressive, but calculated, like he was testing my limits. He monitored his phone more carefully, watched my reactions to small things, subtly tried to assert his influence over decisions I had previously made freely. He didn't suspect that I was observing every single move. He didn't know I was cataloging the pattern of his manipulations, the way he had built a life that seemed normal but was riddled with secrets. The worst part was realizing how deeply he had embedded these lies in our relationship. Even moments that I had cherished, the quiet dinners, the small gestures, the whispered compliments, some of them had been performed to maintain an image. It was impossible to separate genuine affection from carefully constructed deception. And yet, I refused to let this knowledge consume me completely. I told myself that understanding the scale of his manipulation was the first step toward reclaiming control. I didn't confront him, not yet. I couldn't risk giving him an advantage. Instead, I stayed quiet, listening, observing, documenting, and slowly, methodically, piecing together the full extent of the deception. It became clear that his manipulation extended beyond just me. It touched friends, family, finances, and the narrative of our relationship itself. The betrayal was total, and it demanded a careful, deliberate response. By the time I went to bed that night, I felt both exhausted and strangely empowered. My trust in him had been destroyed, but my ability to see clearly, really see, had never been sharper. I had proof. I had patterns. I had understanding. And I knew that when the time came, I could act with precision, intelligence, and control. The man I had married wasn't just deceitful. He was skilled at deception, but I had learned his rhythm, his habits, and his weaknesses. And slowly, quietly, I began to realize that the power was shifting. I wasn't helpless anymore. I was watching. I was learning. And I was preparing that I'll never forget that morning. The sunlight slanted sharply through the blinds, casting lines across the bedroom floor. And for the first time in weeks, everything felt impossibly quiet. He was still asleep, completely unaware of the storm I'd been tracking for so long. My heart was racing, but I kept myself steady, moving slowly toward the corner of the room where I had hidden my notebook and laptop. I needed to confirm it. I needed undeniable proof. No more guessing, no more partial truths. The first step was the laptop. I knew the passwords he used, variations of the same one he had relied on for years. With hands that didn't shake, I entered the final attempt, watching the screen light up like a stage spotlight. The desktop appeared perfectly ordinary, but I knew better. I had been trained in his patterns over days and weeks, recognizing the shadows he left behind in digital form. I opened his email client first. There was the thread I had discovered partially before, now complete, every hidden message laid out like evidence in black and white. Each email hit like a hammer. Not just the romantic correspondence, but the financial manipulations, the meetings he had with people I didn't know, the accounts he had opened without telling me. Each one corroborated what I had suspected. He hadn't simply lied. He had created an entirely parallel life, one carefully hidden beneath the veneer of our marriage. My hands trembled slightly, but I stayed seated, absorbing every word, every date, every subtle lie stitched together across months, even years. And then I found the one message that changed everything. An email sent the morning after our wedding, time-stamped just hours before he had slipped into bed beside me. It was detailed, calculating, outlining a plan to maintain the other relationship while keeping me unaware. The language was clinical, almost emotionless, yet the implications were devastating. He had planned to continue the lie, to manipulate both of us, to control perception and appearances. The scale of it stunned me. I had suspected infidelity, but I hadn't realized the depth and deliberate nature of the deception. I put the laptop down slowly, feeling a weight settle over my chest. The room smelled faintly of the shampoo he used, the same one I had always liked, and I felt a strange mix of grief and clarity. Grief because the man I thought I knew had been false in so many ways. Clarity because I could finally see the structure of his deceit, every foundation and corner laid bare. For the first time, I wasn't guessing. I wasn't wondering. I knew. I flipped open my notebook, scanning the detailed timeline I had been keeping. Each entry aligned perfectly with the emails, texts, and receipts I had quietly collected. The connections were unmistakable, undeniable. Months of casual observations, quiet note-taking, and patient attention had finally paid off. Every inconsistency, every unexplained absence, every small lie I had brushed off, all of it now fit into a clear, coherent picture. I sat there for a long while, letting the realization settle in. My hands were clasped together, pressed against my mouth, my eyes scanning the room as though expecting him to appear at any moment and deny everything. But he was still asleep, unaware that I had uncovered the full scope of his manipulation. I felt a strange combination of relief and exhaustion. Relief because the truth was finally concrete, and exhaustion because the magnitude of what he had done was staggering. Slowly, I allowed myself a moment of sorrow. Not the kind of dramatic, tearful grief that might draw attention, but quiet, internal sorrow for the years of trust one had placed in him, for the moments I had misread as love, for the life I had assumed we were building together. The sorrow was heavy, but it was necessary. It was part of processing what had been hidden for so long. Once the sadness passed, a sense of resolve took its place. I wasn't just heartbroken anymore. I was aware, alert, and methodical. I knew who he was, what he had done, and how carefully he had orchestrated the deception. And now, with this knowledge, I could act, not impulsively, not in anger, but with intention, intelligence, and precision. I gathered all the evidence I could, arranging it in the order I had been tracking for weeks. Emails, messages, receipts, timelines, behavioral notes. They formed a complete dossier that left no room for argument. He could try to lie. He could try to manipulate. But the truth was documented, undeniable, and ready for the moment I chose to reveal it. By mid-morning, when he finally emerged from the bedroom, I was composed, calm, and in control. He greeted me with his usual warmth, oblivious to the storm that had already unfolded silently around him. I smiled in return, masking the turmoil and determination inside. I was no longer a passive participant in this relationship. I was watching, waiting, and preparing. And in that quiet, ordinary morning, I realized something powerful. Knowledge was my strength. The betrayal had been deep, deliberate, and cruel, but I had uncovered it. I had clarity. I had evidence, and I had the first firm step toward reclaiming control over the life he had tried to manipulate. For the first time, the future felt mine again, that I thought I had understood the full extent of his deception. I thought that after hours of carefully documenting messages, emails, receipts, and timelines, I had pieced together the complete story of his betrayal. But the next revelation hit differently, like a sudden, icy gust that knocked the air from my lungs. It wasn't just him. Someone close to me, someone I had trusted implicitly, had known, had enabled it, had protected him while I remained blind. I discovered it while reviewing old text exchanges on my phone, messages I had kept from months before. At first, they seemed innocent enough, family group chats, casual check-ins, small notes about wedding plans. But there it was, buried in the middle of a long thread. A brief message from my sister, asking him something cryptic about keeping it under wraps and making sure she doesn't find out. My heart froze. My sister, the one I had confided in for years, the one I had believed would never deceive me. And there it was in black and white. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone trembling in my hand, staring at the screen as the room felt suddenly smaller, tighter. How long had she known? How much had she covered for him? Every interaction I had had with her over the past year suddenly felt loaded with double meaning. The times she subtly steered conversations, the small hints I had brushed off as coincidence, the little reassurances she had offered me, they all lined up now, pieces of a puzzle I had never wanted to see. The betrayal was compounded. The man I had married had lied to me, yes, but the person I had trusted most in my own family had also been complicit. The realization struck a different kind of hurt, sharper, colder, more cutting. It wasn't just heartbreak anymore. It was disbelief, layered with anger and grief. The two people I had relied on most, the ones who were supposed to protect me, had built this web around me and kept me inside it. I went back through every interaction, every family gathering, every seemingly casual comment. My sister's words, her tone, even the pauses she took during conversations, they now carried hidden meaning. It was a painful exercise, retracing years of trust only to see the faint outlines of deception. I felt like a fool, but more than that, I felt a strange, growing clarity. Seeing it now didn't give me closure, but it gave me knowledge, and knowledge, I reminded myself, was power. The emotional impact was immediate. I felt grief for my marriage, grief for the bond one had with my sister, and a simmering anger that made my jaw ache. But underneath it all, beneath the raw hurt, was a quiet resolve forming in the background. I didn't want revenge through confrontation. I didn't want to shout, accuse, or fight. That would give them the satisfaction of control. I wanted strategy. I wanted subtle, intelligent action. I wanted to reclaim the narrative that they had tried to manipulate. I spent hours that night organizing my evidence. Not just the emails, receipts, and messages from my husband, but every trace of my sister's complicity. Cross-referencing dates, timelines, and interactions revealed that they had coordinated more than I had imagined. It wasn't casual or accidental. It had been calculated. They had built a parallel reality, one in which I remained oblivious while their plans unfolded. I felt the weight of it pressing down, but also the beginnings of a strategy forming in my mind. The next morning, I observed them carefully. My sister's demeanor seemed unusually careful around me, her smile a little too bright, her attention subtly probing. My husband's behavior was no less measured. He had no idea that I had seen everything. The dynamics were shifting now, quietly but irrevocably. I could see the threads of their manipulation, and I understood the depth of the betrayal. But now, for the first time, I also understood my own position in the room. I had patience, foresight, and evidence. They were unaware that the tables were about to turn. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile when they left the room briefly. I wasn't acting yet, not openly, but the plan had begun. I had clarity, proof, and understanding. Every interaction from now on would be deliberate. Every word, every observation, every subtle move would be in service of revealing the truth in a way that left no room for lies or denial. I was no longer simply reacting. I was controlling the pace, the timing, the direction. And in that moment, the betrayal no longer felt like just heartbreak. It was a lesson, a painful, sharp, unforgettable lesson about trust, observation, and patience. They had underestimated me. They had assumed I would remain blind. They had assumed that love and loyalty would keep me passive. But they were wrong. I was watching. I was aware. And soon, they would face the consequences, not through my anger, but through the clarity and quiet intelligence I had cultivated in the shadow of their deception. The next steps had to be precise. The exposure had to be complete. and the fallout had to be undeniable. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest, like steel threading through the hurt. This wasn't about revenge fueled by rage. It was about justice. And finally, I was ready to take it. I didn't act immediately. That wasn't my style. Not now, not after everything I had uncovered. The plan had to be precise, measured, and intelligent. I spent the following days moving quietly, observing both my husband and my sister, noting their patterns, their reactions, their assumptions that I was still oblivious. Every gesture they made, every subtle glance, every whispered conversation in private spaces became data I stored carefully, mentally cataloging what could be used when the time came. I was patient, and patience had become my greatest ally. I began with small, deliberate steps. I adjusted my own routines subtly, leaving traces that would hint at awareness without revealing the full picture. I asked questions casually about past events, about shared finances, about social gatherings, carefully noting how they responded. Every pause, every fumble, every inconsistency they showed fed into the dossier I had been creating for weeks. I wasn't confrontational. I didn't need to be. Control was in knowledge, and knowledge was mine. Next, I reached out quietly to a few close friends and family members I trusted implicitly. I didn't need them to intervene, only to bear witness. I shared selected evidence with them, not in anger, not in accusation, but simply to show the truth that had been hidden. I wanted impartial eyes to confirm what I had already seen. Their reactions were subtle but firm: shock, disbelief, and then understanding. With their awareness, I felt the quiet support of validation, a reinforcement that the reality I had been piecing together was not a figment of my imagination. Meanwhile, I began reclaiming control of the shared spaces in our home. Bills, financial statements, online accounts. I reorganized everything, updating passwords, securing access, ensuring that no manipulations could continue unnoticed. Each action was deliberate, careful, and silent, leaving no room for suspicion. The moment they realized their power had diminished, it would be too late. They would feel the shift without ever anticipating its origin. Socially, I began to reposition myself subtly as well. I started sharing bits of truth strategically, exposing small pieces of their deception to people they trusted in ways that appeared natural and conversational. Nothing reckless, nothing dramatic, just subtle, undeniable facts that slowly reshaped how others perceived the situation. It wasn't public humiliation I wanted, it was consequence. The natural fallout would be more effective than any confrontation could ever be. Emotionally, I maintained calm and poise. My husband and my sister were skilled at manipulating reactions, at reading vulnerabilities, at exploiting doubt. I refused to give them any openings. When they tried charm or guilt, I responded with neutrality. When they tried subtle intimidation, I responded with silence and observation. The balance of power was shifting. They could feel it, even if they didn't understand it yet. The most satisfying moment came quietly. My husband sent a message meant for his secret contact, something I intercepted through the careful monitoring of digital spaces I had quietly arranged. The panic in his words was barely noticeable, but it was there. He had sensed the first tremors of exposure, though he didn't know the magnitude. I read the message, noted every detail, and let it settle in my mind. I didn't respond. I didn't act impulsively. I simply absorbed the proof that the tide had turned. Meanwhile, my sister's subtle missteps began to accumulate. She assumed I was still unaware, that I hadn't seen her part in the deception. But the careful documentation I had amassed made her actions predictable. I didn't need to confront her directly. I only needed to allow natural consequences to follow. Family members, friends, and acquaintances began asking questions, noticing inconsistencies, drawing their own conclusions. The web she had helped weave began to unravel quietly, invisibly, without me uttering a word of accusation. By the end of the week, the transformation was complete. The illusion of control they had held for so long was gone. My husband was cautious, restrained, unable to manipulate freely. My sister was guarded, aware that any false step could reveal the truth. And I was calm, composed, and steady. I had achieved justice without shouting, without anger, without violence. Every action had been deliberate, every observation intentional. I had taken the power they once held and shifted it into my hands, silently, but absolutely. Sitting quietly in the evening, I reflected on the process. The satisfaction wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life. The consequences had been natural, organic, and undeniable. The betrayal had been deep and calculated, but my response had been deeper, more methodical, and ultimately stronger. I had shown that intelligence, patience, and careful observation could outmaneuver deceit in a way that raw emotion never could. I allowed myself a small, private smile, feeling the tension in my chest finally ease. My heart still ached from the betrayal, but the ache was tempered by clarity and empowerment. I had faced manipulation, lies, and complicity, and I had emerged in control. The power dynamic had shifted quietly but permanently, and the truth was now undeniable. And in that quiet evening, I finally understood that justice didn't need to be loud. It didn't require confrontation or drama. It only required patience, precision, and unwavering resolve. I was in charge now. The days that followed felt different, quieter, but in a way that carried weight. The storm of deceit, lies, and manipulation that had clouded my life for months had begun to dissipate, leaving behind clarity and an unexpected sense of calm. I could finally breathe in a way I hadn't been able to before. The tension, the fear, the uncertainty, they had been replaced by something steadier: control, awareness, and perspective. I spent time reflecting on what had happened, not just the betrayal itself, but the lessons hidden within it. I thought about my husband, about the calculated deception, the careful manipulations, the network of lies that had been created around me. I thought about my sister, about the complicity I had never expected, and about the quiet, clever way in which they had assumed I would never see the full picture. It would have been easy to feel only anger and resentment, but I chose a different path. I chose understanding. Understanding doesn't excuse betrayal, but it allows you to see it fully and respond with intelligence rather than impulsiveness. I realized that the pain I had felt, the heartbreak, the shock, the grief, was also the teacher that had guided me to vigilance. I had learned to observe, to analyze, to notice the subtle clues others assume are invisible. I had learned that patience is a weapon stronger than rage, that strategy and foresight are more effective than confrontation when dealing with deception. I also thought about trust, what it meant, how fragile it could be, and how carefully it must be protected. Trust had been broken in the most personal way, and yet I recognized that I had grown stronger for it. I now understood my own resilience, the clarity I could achieve when I refused to allow emotion alone to dictate my actions. I had navigated betrayal without losing myself, without letting the manipulators dictate my emotional state, without allowing them to control the outcome. There was grief, of course. I grieved the relationship I had believed in, the life I had envisioned, the future I had imagined. But grief became tempered with perspective. I learned that heartbreak doesn't always have to end in despair. It can end in clarity. It can end in empowerment. And that was the gift I had taken from these months of deception. Not the betrayal itself, but the ability to see through it, to rise above it, and to regain control of my life. I reflected on love, too. Not the naive, unquestioning love I had given, but the tempered, resilient love I now knew I was capable of. I understood that love requires discernment as much as it requires emotion. It requires attention, observation, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths without turning away. I realized that the love I could offer in the future would be wiser, more selective, and stronger because of what I had survived. Looking forward, I felt cautious optimism. I knew that future relationships would carry the weight of experience, that I would be more aware of red flags, more attuned to subtle signs, more committed to protecting my own heart. But I also understood that awareness doesn't mean suspicion. It means clarity, readiness, and self-respect. I had learned how to navigate a world where appearances can be deceiving, and that knowledge would guide me moving forward. I thought about justice as well. Not revenge, but the quiet, inevitable consequences that truth brings. I had seen it unfold. The lies that had been so carefully woven unraveled naturally. The people who had thought they could manipulate me faced the repercussions of their own actions. And I felt satisfaction not because of their downfall, but because the truth had been restored. Integrity, patience, and intelligence had prevailed, and that was the real victory. And finally, I thought about myself, about my strength, my patience, my ability to see clearly and to act deliberately. I realized that the months of betrayal had tested me in ways I never could have imagined. But I had endured. I had observed, documented, and acted with precision. I had maintained my dignity, my composure, and my sense of self-worth. That realization carried a profound peace, a quiet pride that filled me more than anger ever could. As I prepared for the future, I knew one thing. I had survived the deception. I had faced heartbreak, betrayal, and complicity, and emerged not bitter, but wiser. I was no longer simply a participant in my life. I was its author. And the truth, in all its complexity and pain, had become the foundation upon which I would build the next chapter of my life. The lessons were clear. Trust, patience, observation, and intelligence were stronger than blind love, blind loyalty, or anger. Betrayal could break the heart, but it could also awaken clarity, strategy, and strength. I had learned how to protect myself, how to act without losing my dignity, and how to navigate life with eyes wide open. And for the first time in months, I felt a real sense of peace. I was free, I was stronger, and I was ready to move forward with the life I had reclaimed.